He called her just a diversity hire, then dared to lay a hand on her in front of 282 men. But what she did next shook the bones of every racist who thought she'd stay quiet. They told her to show up early, before the sun had even touched the gravel on Fort Redwell's parade ground. Protocol, they said. But when Leona James arrived, the silence was loud. Not a soul in sight except for the janitor, who gave her a gnawed lace with warning. She stood tall anyway, a black woman from Atlanta, carrying nothing but a laptop bag, a government badge, and the kind of spine you only grow when you've been called aggressive for simply existing. Her job was simple on paper. Train the recruits in civilian military communication strategy. Not combat, not war games, just words. But from day one it was clear this base didn't want her voice, didn't want her skin, didn't want her in that room. Colonel Breyer made sure of that. He greeted her with a handshake that squeezed too long, eyes scanning her like she was an unwelcome audit. "You from D.C.?" he asked, as if the badge didn't say it all. "No, sir. Atlanta." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so affirmative action reached that far down now." The room laughed. She didn't. Her first session was hijacked. PowerPoint slide 2, and he interrupted with a correction that wasn't one. Slide 4, he joked about how urban folks talk. Slide 5, he told her to smile more. People get nervous when you look serious. She finished the presentation anyway, not because she was okay, but because she'd learned long ago how to keep moving when the ground tried to vanish beneath you. The younger soldiers avoided eye contact. The older ones smirked. And in every hallway she walked, there was that sound, boots stopping just long enough to remind her she didn't belong. She made notes, sent reports, got silence. Not even HR would return her calls. One night she stayed late, alone, rewriting the next day's modules. She heard the door open. Boots. And then that voice. "You ever wonder what it's like to earn your place, Miss James?" Colonel Breyer stepped in, reeking of whiskey and arrogance. "This ain't your soapbox. You don't command here. You're a decoration. That's it." And then he touched her wrist, just enough to say, "I can." But she didn't flinch. She stared him down and whispered, "You just gave me everything I needed." The next morning, Fort Redwell felt colder. Not because of the weather, but because Leona walked in wearing something stronger than armor, a stare that didn't blink. The recruits lined up on the field, uniforms sharp, expressions unreadable. And Colonel Breyer, arms folded behind his back like a king surveying dirt. He didn't mention the night before, didn't apologize, didn't flinch, because in places like Redwell, the real power was in pretending nothing happened. But Leona had changed. She wasn't there for their comfort anymore. She was there for clarity. This morning, she announced, "We're not training strategy. We're training truth. And truth gets uncomfortable." Half the soldiers shuffled. Colonel Breyer smiled with that slow, dismissive twitch in his lip. She split the squad into 2 groups. One would simulate a civilian conflict during wartime. The other would document how bias alters decision-making. Within 10 minutes, one of the recruits said, "Ma'am, this feels political." She turned to him. "Being alive while black is political on this base. Recruit, this is survival training. For me." Silence followed. Then movement, tiny but real. One soldier nodded. The seeds were falling. But Colonel Breyer wasn't finished. He interrupted again. Louder this time. "Stand down, recruits. We don't entertain lectures from the woke brigade. Fall back to your stations. Now." Leona didn't move. She walked right up to him. The entire unit froze. Their commander, their trainer, standing 2 feet apart. "You said last night that I didn't earn my place," she said. He laughed. "You didn't." Then she dropped the file folder on the ground. Inside were emails, signed reports, silence from every superior officer who'd ignored her complaints, and taped to the last page, a photo of his hand on her wrist from the training camp footage. His face drained. "You didn't just touch me," she whispered. "You touched every woman who ever said no and wasn't heard. You touched every black voice this base tried to mute with medals and dirt." Breyer stepped forward, too fast. But this time, Leona didn't wait. She grabbed his wrist, flipped it, and dropped him on his back, spine first onto the parade gravel. Gasps, curses, boots shifted. Then she bent down and snapped his arm the same way the system tried to bend her as .282 soldiers watched in silence. And one by one, they stepped back from the man in uniform and toward the woman who'd refused to kneel. They didn't arrest her. They didn't thank her either. Instead, they locked her in a white room with no windows, just a metal chair, a dead clock, and two men with brass on their collars who wore apology like aftershave. "Miss James," the first one began, "we understand it was a physical incident." She said nothing, because women like her had learned, in rooms like these, words were often reinterpreted as weapons. So she let them speak. They used words like review, like protocol violation, like appropriate force. They danced around what really happened. Not one of them said racism. Not one of them said assault. Not one of them said he deserved it. They called her anger excessive, and his aggression a moment of tension. She stared them both down, the same way she stared into her reflection as a girl when her mother said, "Never let them see you fold, even if they hand you the paper." Then she pulled out her own file, one she'd copied, dozens of names, whispers, reports, screenshots from soldiers, past trainees, even a medic who admitted treating bruises that weren't in any log. "He's done this before," she said. "You're Colonel Breyer. I'm just the one who stopped pretending it was normal." The men shifted in their seats, because suddenly it wasn't about her breaking a man's arm. It was about how long they'd let him use his. A week passed. No updates. No press. Just silence thick enough to choke in. And then a letter from the Department of Defense. She read it twice. The first time, to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. The second time, to feel the weight of every comma. They thanked her for her service. They acknowledged the unfortunate behavior of the colonel. They accepted his resignation, effective immediately. But they didn't say sorry. They didn't mention her name. They didn't offer her position back. Just one line at the bottom, in bold. Case closed. No further action required. But for Leona, it wasn't about action anymore. It was about aftermath. She walked the old training grounds one last time, boots echoing on gravel, the wind carrying voices of recruits she once tried to reach. Some watched her leave. Some saluted. Some cried. And as she reached the edge of the fence, a young black recruit, barely 20, ran up to her, eyes wide, breath shaky. "I saw everything," he said. She turned. "Then never forget it." And with that, she walked into a world that still didn't know what to do with women like her. Leona didn't return to the base after that. She didn't need to, because the base followed her, in emails from soldiers who said they saw everything but didn't speak when it mattered, in late-night DMs from female officers who whispered, "He cornered me too, once. I thought I was alone. You weren't the first, Leona, but maybe you'll be the last." And in headlines that never ran, because no one wanted to publish a story about a black woman breaking the silence and a colonel's arm. She found a studio on the edge of Jackson, a dusty converted shipping container filled with Post-its, coffee mugs, and a dozen unfinished dreams. She started teaching again, not under a government program, but through her own. Workshops for women who'd been silenced, recruits who wanted to understand racism without PowerPoints, and veterans who still saw the ghost of command when they looked in the mirror. One day, a woman arrived early, uniform still creased, eyes sharp, voice quiet. "Ma'am," she said, "you don't know me, but I was on the fence that day. You made me want to finish the academy, but not like them. Like you." Leona didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because her tears had already built rivers. She simply handed the girl a folder labeled "Truth," carried forward. And inside, strategies, scars, and every name the system tried to bury AT night. She'd stare at the ceiling and think of how far pain travels before it lands on someone brave enough to catch it. Some nights it kept her awake, but other nights she'd smile. Because even if her name never appeared in the military's history books, it was written in the footnotes of hundreds of untold stories now finding their voices. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon, The kind of southern silence where even the trees seemed too tired to rustle. Leona was running late to her own session. She'd spilled coffee, lost her notes, and her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't saved. It rang again, then once more. Finally, she picked it up, half irritated, half curious. "Miss James," a man's voice said. "This is Sergeant Carraway from Fort Redwell." There was a pause, like he was chewing on guilt. "We thought you should know something happened. Colonel Breyer was dead. Officially an accident. Privately, a confrontation with a former recruit he had once humiliated. A man who had come forward after therapy unearthed memories he'd spent years trying to forget. It didn't end in fists. It ended in a heart attack. Right there, in front of the same training yard where he used to shout down futures with a whistle and a sneer." Leona didn't say a word. Not out of coldness, but clarity. Some men don't collapse. They erode, bit by bit, under the weight of what they denied others. The sergeant hesitated again. "One more thing," he said. "We're holding a review board next week. Would you be willing to speak?" She almost declined. Why return to a place where ghosts were still giving uniforms? But something inside her stirred, not anger, not revenge, but something older than both. A reckoning. When she arrived at Fort Redwell, the air didn't feel the same. It was quieter. More eyes met hers. More salutes were genuine. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore herself, black jacket, steel boots, and the memory of every woman who'd been told she was too loud, too sensitive, too much. The review board was just 3 men. One tried to smile. Another looked at his papers like they might offer a way out. She stood behind a microphone, no notes, no podium. "Let's be clear," she began. "I didn't come here to bury a man. I came to exhume the silence." They blinked. "You promoted him, praised him, protected him, while he treated recruits like dolls to crack open and discard. You gave him medals for the very traits that destroyed lives." One of the men shifted. "Miss James, this isn't—" "No," she interrupted. "This is exactly what it is." She turned to the gallery, where cadets and commanders sat in rigid rows. "You don't need me to retell what he did. You all knew. What you need is to decide if this place will die with him or finally learn to live without him." The room held its breath. She waited, and then said, "Start by changing the flags, because that cloth never waved for me." Outside, wind gathered. Not violent, just insistent. One of the officers looked through the window toward the courtyard. The flag on the pole swayed. Then, suddenly, slowly, the flag's metal latch slipped. It began to slide down. Not torn, not stolen, just descending. Quietly, and for a moment, it felt like the base was listening. Afterward, a line of recruits waited outside. One by one, they shook her hand. Not all of them spoke, but one leaned in and whispered, "You changed the soil here. Now maybe something honest can grow." That night, Leona sat on her studio roof, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the moon. Her boots still had Fort Redwell's dust on them, but her soul felt newer. And as the wind brushed her face, she finally allowed herself to whisper, "We're not just survivors anymore. We're architects." The world didn't change overnight. There were no parades, no glossy articles painting Leona as a hero. The military didn't issue a national apology. No medals were mailed to her door. But something shifted, not in headlines, in people. Young officers began quoting her in private. One base in Texas even removed a commander whose nickname used to be the Wall, because, like the colonel, he thought unbreakable meant untouchable. Cadets started recording conversations. Not out of paranoia, but protection. Whispers turned to policies. Small units requested sensitivity workshops. A general spoke, off the record, about a woman who carried justice on her shoulders when we dropped it from ours. Leona never asked for credit. She asked for truth. And quietly, that's what she started receiving. Boxes arrived at her studio. Anonymous. Inside, journals, letters, photos of bruises, certificates rescinded posthumously from officers who'd once walked with power in their step and rot in their soul. One envelope had only this written inside: "You gave us permission to name our pain." She hung that on her door, not for visitors, For herself. Because some days the weight returned. The dreams. The flashbacks. The memories of how close she came to being another silent statistic. And when it did, she'd sit in front of her mirror, run her hand over the scar near her collarbone, and whisper, "Still here." One rainy Sunday, a woman arrived from Baton Rouge. Mid-40s, former military, 2 daughters. She had tears in her eyes before she spoke. "You don't know me," she said, "but I knew him. I knew what he was, and I said nothing. I thought surviving meant staying silent." Leona didn't flinch. She reached for a folded piece of paper, a simple worksheet she gave everyone who walked through her doors. It read, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is remembering without allowing it to poison you." The woman nodded, breath shaky. She stayed 3 hours. By the time she left, she wasn't shaking anymore. In the months that followed, Leona's workshop expanded. What started in a container became a movement. Retired black officers began mentoring. Trans veterans spoke on panels. White allies sat, listened, took notes, without interrupting. It wasn't perfect. Some came just to argue. Some mocked her online. Some called her the woman who broke a man and blamed it on the system. But she'd learned long ago. They never see the bruises beneath a uniform until someone pulls a fabric back and shows them what survival actually looks like. On the anniversary of the tribunal, Leona held a gathering, not a speech, a vigil. No mics, no cameras, just 37 people in a circle, each one having lived through something they thought no one would believe. They lit candles. They said names. Some whispered, some shouted, but all were heard. And at the end, Leona didn't speak. She simply stood, hands clasped, as one of the youngest in the group. A 19-year-old recruit named Darius stepped forward and said, "You didn't just open the door for us. You stood in the fire so we wouldn't have to walk through it alone." There was no grand monument for Leona James. No bronze statue standing tall in a plaza. No army base renamed in her honor. But in a small hallway of an underfunded community center in East Atlanta, there was a framed photo. It wasn't glamorous. She was mid-sentence, hands moving, eyes fierce, surrounded by women who had once forgotten how to speak up, but now spoke like fire. Beneath the photo, a plaque read, "We were told to obey. She taught us to remember." Leona didn't retire because she never called it work. She just kept going. One town at a time. One room at a time. One voice at a time. Wherever she went, people didn't say, "Thank you" first. They said, "Can I tell you what he did to me? Will you believe me? Is it okay if I'm still angry?" And every time she nodded, because she knew that stories don't need applause, they need permission. Years later, a young girl named Amira stood on a school auditorium stage. She was just 17, a military kid, half black, half Latina, taller than most of the boys in her class, and tired pretending that didn't make people uncomfortable. She cleared her throat, adjusted the mic, and began, "I used to think silence was strength. Then I read about a woman who spoke so hard the walls of a system cracked. Her name was Leona James. The crowd didn't cheer. They leaned in because something in the air shifted, and it sounded a lot like truth echoing." Back in her apartment, Leona watered a plant that barely grew. Its leaves were stubborn, its roots shallow, but still she watered it, because not all growth is visible, and she knew some things bloom only for those who wait. One evening, an envelope arrived. No return address, just a seal with a gold-striped military. Inside, a handwritten letter. "We don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you ever return to Fort Redwell, know this: the barracks where you trained have been renamed. The Leona James Resilience Wing. We finally gave the next generation something honest to stand on." Leona didn't cry. She folded a letter, slipped it behind a photo of her old squad, and whispered, "About damn time." In the final months of her life, she moved a little slower, spoke a little softer. But when she did speak, the room still listened. And one autumn morning, with a breeze curling through the window and the radio playing a soft gospel tune, Leona James took her last breath. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic. It was earned. Her funeral wasn't televised, but it was attended. Black, brown, queer, disabled, Voices once silenced now carried like songbirds. No one read a eulogy. Instead, they passed the mic, and each person told the moment their silence cracked open because of her. In the end, they say legacy is what you leave behind. But Leona's legacy wasn't behind. It was marching forward. In every cadet who refused to be intimidated, every officer who demanded better, every survivor who spoke without shame. She didn't break the system. She made it blink. And sometimes, that's where revolution starts.